Hello and welcome to the first edition, the first session of Engaging Religion and Politics, Navigating the 2020 Election as People of Faith. I'm Neely Hicks and this is my co-host.
All right, good evening. And I want to say welcome to the chapel. Some call it the Fine Arts Room of American Baptist College. We find it fitting and appropriate that such a conversation like this be moderated at a place like this and at a time like this. American Baptist College was founded in 1924 through a joint venture of the National Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention to train Negro clergy. Throughout its 90-year history of training Christian leaders for service in the church and the world, this place has and continues to situate itself squarely in the intersection of religion and politics. Through Jim Crow, through segregation, through the civil rights movement, and now in what some call a post-racial America, American Baptist College sits right in this intersection. So we're glad that Neely and the Glencliff United Methodist Church would allow us to co-host this with you as we hopefully have an engaging conversation tonight.
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you, and I want to introduce you. So you're Reverend Davy Tucker, and you're pastor of Beach Creek Baptist Church, and you are also the program director here at American Baptist College. And thank you so much, American Baptist College, Dr. Harris, for allowing us to use this space. Davy, thank you for just opening it up to us. This is the perfect venue for this series. So I'm co-pastor at Glencliff United Methodist Church here in Nashville, and then I'm also executive director of Harper Hill Global, which is a social enterprise specializing in communications for social good. I want to begin the series by talking about what brought us here to this moment. I co-authored a document called the Statement of Conscience with Martin Sir. And that Statement of Conscience link is on the Harper Hill Global Facebook page. And I hope that all of you will share it, that you'll read it, that you'll feel good about signing it and putting your name on it. But one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that we were not simply signing a document. I think we're often asked so many times to just, oh goodness. We're often asked to just put our names on something, right? We're asked to put our names on something, and then once that happens, we don't know where our names have gone, what has happened, or anything like that. And so with the Statement of Conscience, we really wanted to put it into like tangible expressions of how we can live our lives, because it needs to be a living document. There's 4 action items, and so tonight is the introductory session of the study, and then beginning next week we will take each one of those 4 points, and it will lead us right up until the election. So I just want to now think about for a moment before we turn to our guest. And Davy, we both know that when you talk about religion or politics in polite company, things can get pretty heated, right?
Yeah, you know, I've always heard that, but in my family, that was never the case. We always talked about religion and politics. Some folks would get up and leave the table, but that never stopped the conversation. So the idea of being in the tension of religion and politics, while we were told it was not good graces, no one ever abided by that. So, and I think even now with the pandemic that we're facing, but also this level of civil unrest that seems to be permeating our society, coupled also with the rise of this nationalistic ideology that has Christian tinges. that when we talk about religion and politics, I think it does bring us into some possibly heated, but I think as the name would hopefully engaging conversation around religion and politics.
Yeah, so there's several books that all of you will receive information about. Parker J. Palmer wrote a book called Healing the Heart of Democracy, and I think this is a really good book. It's a thoughtful reflection type of book about how to engage religion and or engaging politics primarily through a lens of caring for one another. And Davey, you said something about holding the tension, and that's something that when the person walked away from your kitchen table, like that, I'm just going to evade this whole conversation. I'm going to leave the room. Parker Palmer talks about how basically we need to stay in the conversation and let us be in the tension so that we can actually move to another side of it, you know, and be present enough to learn things that we might not know and delve into the issues, right?
Well, and it's interesting that you would say Parker J. Palmer, which I've loved a lot of his work down through the years, and that you would approach this in this way that he comes at healing our democracy. I guess I'm more shaped right now in this moment by Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains. And that maybe if we mix a little of those two together, it'll help push this conversation a little bit.
For sure.
I didn't know that you were reading that, and I have reviewed it. And in Parker J. Palmer's classic sense, he always appeals to the better of us. Yeah. And so I'm always looking for that. But time has taught me I need to be prepared for the other side when we don't rise to our better selves. So I'm informed here in this radical rights that is tied, and I guess we'll have to get to them because I don't want to cross over into the history territory, nor too far over into the theology territory with the guests we have with us tonight. But there is a history surrounding America and this idea of democracy. And there's also been a dominant theology that has informed our religion around this idea of democracy. And as Dr. Harris said to me the other day, sometimes the signs that you had on our flyer showing it as an intersection said that sometimes they go the same way. So.
That's so true. That's so true. So you'll see that you're going to get different perspectives from us and then from our guests. So on that note, I think it's time to bring in the guest. So we have Dr. Gary Gerstle, and he is the Paul Mellon Professor of U.S. History at the University of Cambridge. Hi, Gary.
Hello.
Good to see you. And we've got Dr. Forrest E. Harris, the president of the American Bible College. Baptist College.
Well, Dr. Harris is also the professor of the practice of ministry at Vanderbilt University. He's also the director of the Kelly Miller Smith Institute, and he is, I'll say this one for last, he has been the president of American Baptist College for the last 21 years. He's the author of several books. He sits on many boards. He serves in many denominational and I would say quasi-civil and political seats, not only in this city and this state, but even also across the world. So I'm glad to have these two capable, competent conversationalists together for this moment.
Yes, yes. So, Dr. Harris, let's go ahead and hear from you this evening.
Yeah. Thank you both for giving me this opportunity to share in this important conversation. I'm pleased to share in this conversation. I'm glad to see that you are on the campus of American Baptist College, while I'm here at home, sharing with you in this conversation. I might even say this is a crucial conversation that we are having on engaging religion and politics, navigating the 2020 election as people of faith. And I'm equally pleased to share this conversation with Professor Gary Gerstle as a conversation partner with this audience. So Professor, I'm glad to have you and glad to be sharing with you. Without any need for debate, most Americans, I believe, and this nation as a whole, feel that this country is at a critical crossroads in the 2020 US election. The choices that Americans make will determine the future and sustainability of our modern democracy. At stake is a moral vision for a just democracy, human dignity, equity, and equality, not only for the citizens of our American Republic, but it has global implications for a humanitarian, just government and what it ought to look like in the world. I'm particularly sharing with you from the perspective of people of faith. People of faith who believe religion at best is inseparably based in a civic and political philosophy of justice and goodness. These are politically dark times for Christian faith, and the question of truth looms large before us in this election. Even as we acknowledge that an absolute statement of the truth in full and final form is impossible in our conditioned and limited human spheres, no matter what political suasion or religion you might be of, truth is not something that any of us can claim as a final canon or vocabulary for our politics.
Mhm.
But we must vote.
Yes.
We must vote with integrity of consciousness, and I appreciate the document that you have developed, and a representative voice for justice in this election must come forth from people of faith, or it may not surface at all. Existing at the beginning of the American Republic, and more recently during the US presidency of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, Americans ought to now, at this point, have a clear contrast, a clear understanding of the problem we face with great clarity. We have seen a flawed conception of religion and politics. We see the lies, we see the perversion of language, the oppression, the tyranny, the inhumanity, and above all, the imperialism of white supremacy, reasserting old powers of domination and religious ideology for control of our citizenry.
Mhm.
This is not a new phenomenon in the religion and politics of America. At the origins of American democracy is a racist or racism-centered perspective of white supremacy that COVID-19 pandemic has unmasked at various caste systemic levels that perpetuate what James Lawson called, as he mentioned it in the eulogy for John Lewis, a continuation of racism, militarism, and plantation capitalism. What James Lawson means by these terms is that they take the form of European America's systemic exercise of domination and oppression not only over racially subordinate groups, but ultimately limits democracy and potentially can ruin the democratic experiment for all Americans. I offer this up first as we begin the conversation because I think voting is not separated from social policy development and implementation. And I hope we can talk about this in the way in which the collective voice of America and its voting franchise is the basis for developing and implementing public policies for democracy to fully be expressed toward all of American citizens, which those policies have not been because of the institutionalized white supremacist values in all branches of our government. And until we face that flaw in our system, our voting and how we negotiate our new relationships each 4 years or in our local governments, that system will continue to recycle itself in various forms to continue to make it difficult, challenging for the kind of beloved community that Congressman John Lewis and Dr. King and others talked about. I have more to say, but I want to make sure that I open with some sense of how your questions to me and to my colleague here have given me some perspective that we must start negotiating a new relationship with government through our voting, but our voting must be educated and connected with the history of how our voting has kept systems of oppression, and in my instance here, in terms of racial injustice, white supremacy, in place in all branches of our government. I'm looking forward to having the conversation.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Such important
Yes.
words. And I mean, it gives us such meat just to dive into for this conversation. So, Dr. Gary Gerstle, please share with us your opening thoughts as we launch this series and this evening.
Well, thank you very much. First, I want to thank Reverend Hicks and Reverend Tucker for this invitation. I want to say it's great to be back in Nashville, even if my return is only virtual rather than real, but life is kind of virtual these days. I spent 8 wonderful years in Nashville, Tennessee, 2006 to 2014 when I taught at Vanderbilt, and still have really strong ties. I'm speaking to you not from Cambridge, England, but from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I also have a home. The virus has messed with my itinerary, profession, et cetera, hoping to get back to England, but I have not made it there yet. And at birth, I was a Cincinnati boy, not all that far from Nashville. And it's good to be back in your region. I share with Dr. Harris a strong sense that this is a very dark time. Can we believe the week we've just been through? The revelation to end all revelation occurred last Sunday with the tax revelation. That was only a week ago. Seems like a year ago because it pales in comparison to what happened at the debate and then what happened with Trump getting the coronavirus. I want to use my opening remarks to deliver a message of hope in this dark time, actually. Not through a religious lens, because that would misrepresent me. I am a historian of the United States. I study politics, I study race, I study immigration, I study social movements. I study just about anything to do with the 20th century in America. I've been doing it for 35 years and still have not had a boring day, and I'm still learning new things about our wonderful and immensely frustrating and problematic country. I want to do what I can do best, which is to take you back in history and to talk to you about another moment of darkness and polarization. Almost 100 years ago, 1924. And I'm not going to talk to you about what for this audience might be the most familiar source of darkness, and that was the deep antagonism in the 1920s between white America and Black America. I want to talk to you instead about the deep antagonism that we don't talk about anymore because it's gone. And that is the deep antagonism between Protestants and Catholics in America at the time, between two religious communities that were at each other's throats. It's hard for me to teach students in England or America, couldn't do it at Vanderbilt either, about the depths of the antagonism between Protestants and Catholics. And the reason it was so hard to teach is because it doesn't really exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And therein lies a message of hope, I think, that I want to share with you. 1924, the Democratic Party gathered at Madison Square Gardens to nominate a president. The two contenders were Al Smith, governor of New York, Irish Catholic. The other was William McAdoo, the nephew, a North Carolina boy, the nephew of Woodrow Wilson, the standard bearer of the Democratic Party in the South. It took them 10 days in the sweltering heat of July in Madison Square Gardens, no air conditioning, 103 ballots to choose a president. And when the 103rd ballot failed to produce a president, the two contenders dropped out. And someone else was nominated, someone that no one remembers because he got crushed in the general election. My point is that the party was hopelessly divided between North and South, between Catholics and Jews, who were the base of the Democratic Party in the North, and Protestants, white Protestants, who were the base of the Democratic Party in the South. And it was also torn between the wets, who wanted to drink freely and publicly, and the dries, who thought that prohibition was God's salvation for America. Nominating Al Smith in 1924 was a man by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt, his first public appearance after his terrible bout with polio, re-entering courageously the political scene. And for him, this was a horror show, and he said to himself, and then publicly, this can never happen to the Democratic Party again. And in 1936, at his nominating convention for re-election as President of the United States, he was first elected in 1932. The two halves of the Democratic Party that had torn themselves apart in the 20s were now reunited and propelled Roosevelt to one of the greatest victories in politics in American history. Gave us labor law, gave us Social Security, gave us a welfare state, gave us a tax on the rich, redistributed income from the rich to the poor. All this was accomplished because of this alliance. Partly, Roosevelt's message was be religious, but keep religion at some distance from politics, because politics can't handle religious issues that well. Maybe an issue we want to talk about. But partly, he was creating a new image of America, one that made room for a multitude of religious groups. Until that time, America had defined itself, or the powerful groups in America had defined itself as a Protestant nation. And out of the Roosevelt and New Deal revolution came an image of America as a Judeo-Christian civilization, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, all equally American. Groups that have been at war with each other were now acknowledging their ability to work together. Fast forward then to 2020 and to Amy Coney Barrett, a hugely controversial candidate for an incredibly important position on the Supreme Court. I don't want to talk about what makes her uncontroversial. I don't want to talk what makes her controversial. We can get into that. Let's pause for a moment to consider what's not at issue, that she's a Catholic. And why should it be an issue? 5 Catholics already sit on the court, 2 Jews, and the one Protestant who sits on the court, occupying what we might call the Protestant seat, was raised a Catholic. So he's only half a Protestant in a way. His name is Neil Gorsuch. This kind of court was unimaginable 100 years ago. Occasionally, there have been a Catholic. The first Jew, Louis Brandeis, was appointed in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson over furious and vicious opposition, but he got the seat. That America has undergone this kind of transformation encourages us to think today of how America might be transformed in ways that seem unimaginable to us. We can imagine the negative, awful things that could happen in America. Dr. Harris stressed white supremacy. We can mention autocracy. We can note the possible end of American democracy as we know it. We can fill ourselves with these negative imaginings of what America might become. But what of the positive? What is unimaginable now from a positive perspective? Franklin Roosevelt came into office at a similarly pessimistic moment. Functioning democracies in the world had sunk to single digits. There were less than 10 functioning democracies in the world. Strong men bestrode the stage. Strong men like Trump bestrode the stage everywhere. Tens of millions of people were out of work. Many had lost hope. And yet hope prevailed. American democracy revived. The revival was not perfect. Racial equality, it needs to be said, was always secondary to the politics of Franklin Roosevelt. That's an issue we will want to talk about. But the 1930s revival of democracy was strong enough to draw blacks away from the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, the Republican Party, as hard as that is to imagine today, and toward the Democratic Party, setting the stage for the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. And there were people of hope in the 30s who were imagining that future. And so I want to find a way before this evening is done and before this election season is done to call us to hope about how we might imagine America, an America that currently does not exist.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know, that does give hope to be able to see how far we've come in this area.
Yeah.
And we can see where we're at right now and how much farther we need to go to have people, you know, 100 years from now saying, oh, but let's look back to 2020 and look at what they were dealing with versus where we are now. So, Dr. Harris, what?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that historical perspective and grounding this conversation in what I would not have been able to imagine, the schism and the fight between Catholics and Protestants, and how that current configuration on the U.S. Supreme Court is now mimicking somewhat the ideological frame of Catholicism and all Protestant ways of thinking about this country. So I appreciate that grounding. And when we speak of hope these days, I think in terms of how I come at that word these days, I remember a phrase from Paula Murray, a womanist activist back in the early 30s. She says, hope is a song in a weary throat. It's a song in a weary throat, and the throats that are weary are the throats that have been abused by white configurations of religion, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, and white ideologies and canons that separate politics from religion. And I think in terms of whatever I can understand about history and the historians that I'm exposed to at Vanderbilt, John Meacham and Warren Floyd Thomas, among others, is history in its most truest sense, and you can help me understand this better, Gary, is a radical commitment to telling the truth about the past. And America has not told the truth about the past, and particularly how it has used the rudiments of religion and the Anglo-Saxon myth of superiority to give some kind of manifesto about what our American public could look like with religious-based understandings of white superiority. And every system that has been developed from that premise continues to perpetuate that Anglo-Saxon myth in different forms and variations, to the point in our contemporary democracy, the weary throat that Paula Murray talks about are the throats of people who have been lynched, who have been murdered, who have been denied all of the promises and flourishing of this democracy. And I've been out on the limb, Gary, saying this theologically and religiously, that if it had not been for the constant agitation and struggle and striving for freedom of Black people in this country will not be where it is today in terms of its vision of democracy. And perhaps those people, the nonconformists, the undergroup, the undercurrent of that group, is yet the salvation of this country in terms of what democracy could mean. So I just wanted to lay that. You just got me fired up, Gary.
Well, let me.
History and all of this understanding of politics and religion, I think, come together because America has a religion, and it has had a religion that is made idolatrous around how it sustains the myth of white Anglo-Saxon superiority.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. And I want to take what you just said, a statement that you just said, and give that back to Dr. Gerstle to respond to, that America would not be where it is now had it not been for, and that's why I ran out of what you were saying, and I'm not going to try to replace those words, but the perennial struggling and suffering of folk for equality and inclusion in this idea of America. I hope you heard kind of what he said too, Dr. Gerstle, as I try to reinterpret it. And from your lens as a American historian, how would you respond to that?
I agree with it. Let me first say what a beautiful phrase, hope is a song in a weary throat. I've written that down and I'm going to remember it. And it captures both the pessimism and the weariness of struggling against all odds and suffering so many defeats, and yet hoping nevertheless that something can change and something good can come. Most of the best things that have come in America have come through struggle. And many of these struggles, if they find themselves into the formal electoral political arena, have begun outside politics or formal electoral politics. And they involve the unheard, the discriminated against, those who were crushed under various kinds of burdens. It has involved them standing up for what's right, for what's fair, for what's just. Sometimes grabbing the sacred documents of America, the Declaration of Independence, the proposition that all men are created equal, or the first words of the Constitution, we the people are sovereign. Sometimes grabbing that as notes of inspiration, and sometimes saying there's nothing to be saved in those original American documents. We go back to the period of the struggle against slavery. The struggle of slavery wouldn't have succeeded but for the struggle of slaves to end the circumstances of their unfreedom. And there was a white man who said, this William Lloyd Garrison, a leading abolitionist, who said, the Constitution can't be saved. It must be torn up. And then there was Frederick Douglass, who declared, we will make the Constitution a living and breathing document. We will use it to end slavery and establish a colorblind republic. And he was a force in leading America toward freedom and emancipation, and a force in the original Reconstruction, the effort in the 12 years after the Civil War ended to put whites and blacks on equal footing. It was partially successful, but it also generated a furious counterattack and furious counter-revolution. So we have in that moment hope, and then a 90-year period of reaction and abundant cause for weariness. And then came the second Reconstruction of the 1950s and 60s under the leadership of great weariness of Martin Luther King on the one hand, and anonymous 20-year-old students at a bunch of Nashville colleges and universities, led by the old man Lawson. They called him old man. He was all of 28 at the time, leading a second Reconstruction, which was also partially successful, and whose crowning moment was the election of Obama to the presidency of the United States, something that I thought was unimaginable in my lifetime. And then the vicious attack against Obama and everything he represented, which is what we're living through now.
Today.
And my hope is that we will begin to imagine a third Reconstruction. And what characterizes Reconstructions is that they are led by blacks for the broader cause of freedom, and able to attract to their banner sufficient whites in America so as to make this a majority force capable of exercising political power. And my hope for this current moment in the 10 or 20 years going forward is that we will find a way to this third Reconstruction so that hope can be a song once again.
Thank you for that response. I'm going to pass to my cohort here for the next question, but we're also asking for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live that if you have any questions, would you please just write them in the comment section, and our facilitator, executive producer, Quentin Cox, will get those for us.
Yes,
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to cover and digest in what the two of you have just shared. I think that that sense of hope, people are weary about it. Some people who are oblivious to systemic racism, they can't see it because they are so enveloped in it. You know, those things are going on, and I see comments from my friends in Africa in 2016 when we were mourning this loss and thinking of, you know, what does this mean? How could this have happened? And I was reminded by one of my friends there that, you know, America has always been a racist country. It's just that we covered it up. We, you know, white people covered it up. White people thought that there was no problem. There was no problem. And that now what we've seen over these last 4 years is this opening of a wound, or not even opening of a wound, but like uncovering a festering wound that was always there. And that we didn't have the courage to delve down into it and rip apart that flesh of woundedness and look at it and really start the healing process by creating a new system. So you both alluded to, or both talked about the Constitution, whether it's something that should be ripped to shreds, you know, is it salvageable? I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how, you know, they weren't trying to create something new. They were trying to get the American people to live into what was already so. So, Dr. Harris, what are your thoughts about that in this day? How can we, or can we, salvage the Constitution?
Well, as my colleague this evening, Gary, has again given us a stroke of the historical development of our vision of the Constitution. In the preamble of the US Constitution commits the nation to the establishment of social justice, the inalienable rights of people. So at the core of that philosophy is a just republic. And if the Constitution as our primary creedal document that forms the way in which we identify the republic, the hope that we are speaking about tonight has to be a hope narrated by people who are committed to justice. And sometimes the only way to change our perspective of what forms us, we have to change the narrator. The narrator cannot continue to be the way in which white dominant culture has narrated what hope means. It cannot only be from the voice of people whose privilege has helped shape the nation in the ways that gave that privilege constant dominant control over definitions of Black life, Asian life, or life in America. We have to change the narrator of hope. And the narrator of hope now must be the people themselves. Black, white, all American citizens must develop this narrative of hope out of their new commitment for a new kind of America. But the problematic is that the bulk of the dominant hegemonic understanding of America is still based in government, based in education, and based in the politics and the politicians that the general public continue to elect to office without any critical loyalty to the justice that the Constitution says should be a part of all persons' life. So we continue to have had amendments after amendment. What sense does it make to have a 1965 Voters' Rights Act for African-American persons to vote in this country when all of the years and decades of centuries of them struggling to have the vote is finally given to them the right to vote in 1965? And how can we not recognize that struggle and that hegemonic imperialistic power over Black life to control Black life and other people's lives as something that the Constitution and all our founding documents must address by a kind of revisiting what the Constitution meant in its original development and context? We keep talking about the founding fathers, and we have constitutional originalist, and I think that is what the new nominee is supposedly have, is a originalist view of the Constitution. When I don't think any document, and to get into the whole sense of the Bible and religion, the Bible or religion can remain frozen in a context to give meaning to future generations and different ways in which we must understand how to apply it. So that's what I would say, to not throwing away the Constitution, not shredding it, but owning the lie that it represented for white supremacy and white control and dominance, owning how it has been used and how it has been exploited over some sense of national unity, over some sense of national solidarity around a patriotism that guards America for what America wants to be for herself, over and against what the Constitution and its implications for all of its citizens should mean. I think we have to deal with that kind of honest conversation and then invite the hope that Gary has described historically, and what I'm trying to develop in some kind of theological perspective using maybe Dr. King's beloved community or John Lewis, understanding that the vote is something almost as a sacred weapon in the hand of people to make America better. But that hope must be grounded in a kind of openness to a vision of human life that gives people's humanity and the way they exchange in their relationships in the marketplace and all the phases of our life, our citizenry, that is just. I'll stop there, but that's how I see us dealing with the Constitution.
Mhm.
Okay. Dr. Gerstle, can you respond to that in just a little bit?
Yes, and I'll note that on our chat, we're beginning to get some questions about other subjects. So I just want to note that they're on our radar and we will get to them.
Yes, I see them, and I wanted to know if you wanted to respond to what Dr. Harris.
I would like to, because I appreciate Dr. Harris's comments very much. Changing the Constitution is the subject that makes me really weary.
Mhm.
It has to be done, and yet it can't be done. That is one of this country's biggest problems. Antonin Scalia and I disagree on just about everything in the world, except we agree one thing, that the founders made a big mistake in making the Constitution too hard to change. It's clear that a majority of Americans do not support Donald Trump. It's clear that the Republican way of surviving is to find a way to make a minority party a majority force controlling the presidency through the Electoral College and the Senate. It is clear as day that there's no way in a democracy 30 states should provide 70% of the senators and 70% of the population provide 30% of the senators. It is so clear that the road to health for our democracy lies in getting rid of the Electoral College, but it's almost impossible to change the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest changes of the Constitution occurred during and after the Civil War. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, outside of the first 10, the Bill of Rights, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment, emancipation of declaring slavery to be outlawed, giving blacks full rights as American citizens, that they could not be second-class citizens under any circumstances, the 15th Amendment ensuring their right to vote. These are the three most important amendments to the Constitution. How did they happen? How did America get a new birth of freedom? It occurred at a time when the southern states were not part of the Union and could not obstruct the ratification of those amendments. In other words, it took a war, 700,000 dead, to change the Constitution in this major way. And the question that we face going forward, and I wish I had a better answer to this,
Mm-hmm.
is how do we change aspects of the Constitution that are so essential to the health of the American Republic, the American democracy? There would be a lot more hope here right now if we didn't have to worry about Electoral College. And Trump would have left office a long time ago if he never would have gotten elected, if the popular vote had governed our governing system. So this is a subject that makes me weary. I think about it a lot, and yet I have no easy way for suggesting that we make the changes in the Constitution that need to be made.
Thank you. There's a question that says, Dr. Gerstle, can you speak to the way that Jews were made fun of in French and German newspapers in the 1930s, and how the acceptance of disrespecting Jews by the public led to the Holocaust being made possible? Reason that question jumped out at me is I'm still reflecting from the presidential debate. All of what was said, my one takeaway that I am still trying to process is when Donald Trump said to the Proud Boys, and by virtue, white nationalists, to stand back and stand by, that I heard something else. And I think this question here that goes back to the 30s and the issue as it relates to the killing of millions of Jews. So the question again is, Dr. Gerstle, can you speak to the way that Jews were made fun of in French and German newspapers in the 30s, and how the acceptance of disrespecting Jews by the public led to the Holocaust being made possible? And my contemporary context is our president's comments during the presidential debate?
Well, this is a very personal issue for me because both my parents were born and raised as Jews in Germany, and both were refugees from Nazism. The defining moment in my mother's life was Kristallnacht, November 8, 1938, the night of shattered glass, when Nazi stormtroopers broke into her family's apartment in Darmstadt, Germany, and carted away my grandfather to Dachau concentration camp. My mother's family believed in the possibility of emancipation in Germany, just as many people believed in their own emancipation in the United States. So they had trouble tearing themselves away from that dream. My father's family never bought into that dream. They left earlier, but for them, the flight to America saved their lives. Many family members were lost. And I've heard many times from them the march of fascism, Nazism, day to day, those who are victims kind of staring in disbelief that they who were once fully accepted members of these societies were step by step being turned into scoundrels, vermin, people fit for imprisonment, discrimination, and ultimately death. My mother lived a very long and beautiful life in America. She died in November of last year, November 2019, at the age of 93. And she saw in Trump what she had seen in Germany in the 1930s. And it scared her and moved her tremendously. And it was a very, very hard moment for her. I don't think it's accidental that Trump is unleashing these forces of vigilantism, violence, domestic terrorism, just as the last survivors of the Holocaust are dying, the last witnesses are dying. And one of the elements of your statement of conscience that I appreciated the most and moved me the most is your reference to the religious institutions of Germany, what some did, what others didn't do, and the importance of people of faith standing up, being counted, speaking truth to power, putting themselves on the line, making their voices heard, in full knowledge of the horrors that humans are capable of inflicting on each other. And I think what I take from my mother's life and her example and the lessons she taught me is that when these threats present themselves, we must stand up against them, stand with others who share our beliefs, persuade yet more to join our ranks. Because humans do have a great capacity for humanity toward each other. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we must find in ways that suit us. For some, this will be religion. For some, it will be a secular form of ethics. To stand up and to be counted, to take note, to stand tall and to stand firm, and to put forward a vision of the world where it's declared this cannot be allowed to happen. That's probably much more of a personal story than you were expecting in my response to this question, but it's not a story I could have avoided telling.
No, but politics are always personal.
Yeah.
So is religion. Mm-hmm. So I can contextualize your story to even be able to at least make a good guess at your politics. So no, I thought it was very, very appropriate. Dr. Harris, would you like to respond to that just briefly?
Yeah, the Holocaust, the global way in which it was allowed to occur in terms of people not responding, our government not responding, at a moment, at a time when the ideological way in which we understood Jews and other non-religious people in terms of American understanding of Christianity and American understanding of its patriotism, to have allowed that to have occurred is what I think, what one Father John Tracy Ellis, a church historian from Catholic University, said decades ago, that sometimes we get caught up in the cult of democracy in a way wherein that cult does not allow us to see and involve ourselves in the liberation of others and to respond to their suffering. And we allow groups to be oppressed and suffer in a way that we could, as a global community, prevent. So in Sudanese cultures in Africa, and famine cultures and civil conflict in other global situations, we seem to have less imagination and our resources or apply our global impact on how to solve these sufferings against the humanity of people whom we don't understand. And so I really appreciate the story, Gary, because it resonates with the stories, again, of what has happened to people in this country. The Japanese camps that occurred here in America, it's emblematic of an example of how we had the Jim Crow era and the Reconstruction era and all the ways in which pockets of that kind of poverty and suffering still exist in people in our modern democracy. So I think there needs to be some openness to what we can understand about democracy and what we can understand about the humanity of others, as Dr. King would put it, an interrelated mutual network that ties all humanity together, and that what indirectly happens to others directly happens to us, or what directly happens to us indirectly happens to all. And if we can kind of carry that forth beyond being caught in this cult of democracy. Now, what I think he means by that cult, it becomes cultic and idolatrous to the point wherein it's in a fixed metaphor for us and us only, when democracy should be fluid and open as a way in which all persons in the world can begin to experience what life can mean and not be camouflaged or bankrupt with a national ethic of democracy from America's perspective. And that's, I think, how xenophobia grows. That's how I think we can all get in solidarity against terrorism, the 9/11 assault on American soil, and the Islamic phobia that grew from it, and that we were being attacked from outside by terrorism. And we all came together as a nation in solidarity against such attacks against us on our soil, rightfully so. But at the same time, those kinds of ways in which people in America understood terrorism from the outside cannot put his mind around terrorism on the inside, and how people are terrorized in poor neighborhoods and Black communities. They can't understand how George Floyd and his death is an act of terrorism against a neighborhood where the evolution of crime and criminality has been a part of how those communities had to exist in fear. They can't see how poverty and how an affordable health care act and having people not have access to health care becomes an act of terror when people die every day from not having adequate health care because of their wealth, or the wealth gap, or the way in which wealth is disseminated in this country keeps people in positions of oppression and terror and fear. So I just think we got to find some kind of way to break the cultic vision that America has of itself so that we can respond to these kinds of human sufferings wherever they may appear.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that has really stood out to me in this part of the conversation is the way we talk about each other. And I think the person who asked this question about the those of the Jewish faith being ridiculed in newspapers, and we think about how derogatory the terms were that were used in the 2016 election about the immigrants coming in, and how these things don't happen overnight. We talked about that in the statement of conscience, that the Holocaust does not happen overnight, that the terrorism does not happen overnight against those of Black skin. We need to be thinking about, like, how do we talk about each other? Because it's when people are reduced through language that the physical harm becomes acceptable, and people are in a fog and don't even see it. It happened during the genocide in Rwanda, where people had been on the radio and talking about others as if they were cockroaches. So then they could slaughter their neighbor and somehow not even feel an awakening of conscience. And so the language that we use is so important in this. One of the things that we see in this election is whenever we see the political ads, and we'll be talking more about this in particular in the fourth session, but the language that are used in political ads and how they turn people on one another as a knee-jerk reaction. Another person is asking, how do we help people understand that the behavior we see right now, the response of white supremacists, is fascism, and that's dangerous. Dr. Gerstle, let's go to you next.
Well, that's a very good question, and the answer is not so easy. Trump suffered in the debate on was it Tuesday or Wednesday night? The debate, it was Tuesday night. Yes. Yeah, that seems like a long time ago too. But the crudeness of his remarks, the attacks on Biden, the refusal to let him speak, the utter incivility, all his actions governed just by a tremendous urge to dominate. What I thought of was the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, shock and awe.
Yes.
That's what came to mind. Just bombs away constantly. It didn't work against Biden, and I think Trump erred. And I think the indications from the polling are that his behavior hurt him, not with his base, and I'll have a few comments about his base in a moment, but he can't win with his base because it's right around 40%, and it's not enough to bring him a second term. He needs the white elderly, he needs white suburban women. The shock and awe at his performance in so many sectors of American society, the revulsion against him was so intense that it cost him. And I saw one poll today that showed Biden up in a national poll, 53% to 39%, a greater gap than we've seen ever in this election race. Now, one has to take those poll numbers we have to consider those carefully, because what matters ultimately are not the national polls, but the state by state polls. That's going to determine the next president. So the people who thought they no longer had a capacity to be shocked by Trump were on Tuesday night shocked by Trump. And the man, it seems to me, has no limits in terms of his willingness to upend norms. We've also never had a presidential candidate in all of American history who has talked in his terms about what will happen if he loses the election.
Right.
In his mind, it's not imaginable that he would lose the election except by theft of the election. And when he's been asked point blank numerous times what he would do if the vote went against him, all he'll say is, "We'll see," and then calling out the Proud Boys to stand ready, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election. Every norm that he can bust, he wants to bust. Democracy can't survive by law alone. It cannot survive by a constitution alone. It requires norms. It requires civic ideals. It requires morals. And here, religion can be an important source of that morality. And I see in Trump a man who is indifferent to those norms and that morality. America has been around a long time. Its norms are very strong. It can withstand a lot, but I'm not sure it can withstand another 4 years of the battering to which they would be subjected. I think what I don't understand is, so there is a majority of Americans, and it's important to remember, it is a majority of Americans that is deeply upset about Trump's behavior, both in the short and long term. Mm-hmm. What I don't really understand is his base and its impermeability and how difficult it is to peel anyone away from here. And I'm thinking of Dr. Harris's words about the capacity of democracy to be cultic and idolatrous. I was really struck by that phrase, and something of the cultic and of idolatry has become part of that base. It seems impervious to what we value in a positive sense about democracy, which is deliberation, discussion, persuasion. What I wonder most of all is families. These are great moments of entertainment, his rallies, and I've watched quite a number of them because as a historian, it's important for me to understand their dynamics, what's going on there. And part of what remains mysterious to me is whole families, parents bringing their children to hear this kind of language. And that kind of language then gives them permission to use that language with each other, with their opponents. And this is, I think, a road toward a kind of fascism, which celebrates the cultic and celebrates the idolatry of the leader.
Yeah. Gary.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Gary, thank you so much. You know what? When you mentioned this this idea of people bringing their young people, their children, their families, my mind went back to the lynching culture where people came and brought their children. And I remember one quote, I may paraphrase it. He says, "I want my son, my siblings, my children to see this so that it can be ingrained in their consciousness in a way where they never will forget that white people and white superiority reigns." And wherein I think the cultic and idolatrous character of the violation of norms as Trump represents, what idolatry does is it incapacitates people to distinguish between subject and object. Trump becomes the sum of what America is. And that's what frightens me more than anything, is Trump America? Mm. Is Trump the American character? And that's what's frightening. Wherein you, myself, people of faith, black and white, a diversity of people's orientation in religion or politics or stories like you shared in terms of your grandparents. And I can share stories of my father and my grandparents. these stories are the power base of us being the new narrators of hope. And unless those stories get told, and we range for a kind of openness theologically and religiously for those stories not to be co-opted by the toxicity in religion, the whole toxic culture of white evangelicalism, this whole substitutionary atonement about person's soul after they die, over and against the justice for oppressed bodies, justice for the abuse of bodies, the border wall and the abuse of children coming to this country and put in cages. If we can change the narrator, I think we have a chance to save democracy from its cultic tendencies, to uplift someone like Donald Trump, wherein his base cannot distinguish him between the objective that we have for our collective humanity.
Well, you kind of answered what I was you really went toward what I was gonna try to say. I was just rolling off of one of Dr. Gerstle's comments when he said it takes more than a constitution to be a democracy, and that religion could be a source of that morality. In Sarah Posner's new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, she talks about how his base is made up of white evangelicals and what we would call the alt-left. Now they seem like very strange bedfellows, but if she's correct, is religion, or could religion really be a source of that morality? And I'll give that to you, Dr. Harris, and then to you, Dr. Gerstle.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier about my analogy about religion and politics not being at a cross intersection, but in alignment, is that the religious ideological frames of what occurs to give power and energy to politics that are representative of a Trump, or the norms that get broken or challenged, is a religious base for how they continue to use religion. I heard a white supremacist Klansman on Facebook with his robe on, talking about the George Floyd issue and all of the things that he thinks that represents. And in the same breath, he said that he wants to call America back to God. In the same breath, he's talking about God as being the support of what America needs. And all of that kind of religious understanding is the toxic, polarizing way in which religion itself can no longer be the narrator of the story or of the new democracy. Not American Christianity particularly, in the way that it has. But I also recognize, Brother Tucker, that there are American Christianities, not just one American Christianity. And we have to delineate between the Christianities that are out there over and against what is the real Christian ethic that Dr. King and others attempted to promulgate as a way for beloved community to be shaped in the American consciousness. And if we can identify that level of Christian faith with other religions, Buddhism and all other religious faiths, and see them not in doctrinal conflict, but in unity about what it is that is the best about humanity, I think we have an opportunity to narrate another story.
Yes, we do. We do.
Dr. Gerstle.
Well, in one sense, the answer to your question is simple. Can religion become a source of morality? And the answer is yes. But it's also very complex, and religion can also be contaminated by politics in very serious and damaging ways. And one of the mysteries to me is how evangelicals can be, white evangelicals in America can be so enthusiastic for a man whom I regard as probably the least Christian man ever to inhabit the White House. He fits much more comfortably in a pagan frame than in a Christian frame, and how they can so easily make a peace with him is another of the mysteries that I spend a lot of time pondering. There's no doubt that religion can be contaminated by politics. The original revolt of Protestantism against Rome and the papacy was against a religion that was thought that Christianity was compromised because the Pope had become too powerful politically, and he had lost sight of the godly. So there are numerous moments, and we can say, and I'm with Dr. Harris entirely on this, that there are aspects of Christianity historically in this country that have been entirely saturated by white supremacy, which of course is not a religion, but a form of politics. And it has prompted some within the Black community to say Christianity can never be redeemed. This was Malcolm X's message. And so he parted with Martin Luther King over this matter, right? This was a chief source of division between them. King believing that Christianity could be redeemed and salvaged, and Malcolm X saying, no, it can't. And so I am jettisoning at this moment my Christian name, and you will never, Little, his last name, and you will never call me by that name again. One understands the impulse that drives many people in that direction. I understand it completely. My final thought is this. Religion has always been a powerful force in America and in its history, and it likely will be for the foreseeable future. So those people who think that the path to the future is getting rid of religion, they don't live in the America that I know, and I know it pretty well. How many churches does Davidson County have? 660, one county, is that about right?
I believe it's even more than that now.
Even more than that. And Sunday morning, I used to do a lot of bicycle riding, and Sunday morning I'd love to go out because there was no one on the streets. Everyone was in church, and the seculars were worshiping at Whole Foods. But Nashville on Sunday morning reminded me of Jerusalem on a Saturday morning. Everybody was in a house of worship. This is not going to disappear anytime soon, and that's why I think religion has to have a voice in politics. It can't just be said that Christianity or any religion is so compromised by politics that I will have nothing more to do with it. One has to find, I think, a way through religion to a better politics. And if I'm understanding the point of this group correctly, that's one of its missions, and I think it's the right one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a good question to kind of summarize, to get us moving towards that direction is the one that says our faiths tell us we are our brother's keeper and to love the other as we love ourselves. Democracy in Chains tells us how a committed group of people in power preach exactly the opposite. Now I want to I think we've talked somewhat about that.
And that last little bit is part of that question.
Okay. Oh, it's asking about, has this always been the case historically? Is there a reason to believe we can find our way back to the middle? You know, I do think at that core, it's like, y'all just love each other. I mean, that's what it's all about, like loving each other. Davey, tell them. It's about loving each other, and that, like, when something gets in the way of that, like, we got to say no, right?
You say that to a preacher and a pastor, and I'm not on the panel. And so I think that I have a saying, when love is not the law, power and authority become necessary for social order. I believe that. But I think that there are places where love is not required that can create a more just world. And if you can't give me love, help me get toward a more just world. Because for me, for love to show up in my religious understanding of that, justice has to already have cleansed the room.
Oh, wow. Yes.
So that precedes it. It gives love a place to come. So I think our working toward that, hopefully with manifesting love, but there's a lot better we can do with each other on just being people to get to that. So I'm not here for this. I wanted to make sure that we get these last couple comments in. We're at 7:51. And Neely, I don't know how you want to wrap this up with a closing statement or whatever, but y'all have said so much. I can't concretize any of it. I've been taking notes on what both of you have been saying. And some of it will actually preach. Even from you there, Dr. Gerstle. And it may actually show up. But I am just so grateful for the convergence of the way you all seem to point toward this idea of hope from two different perspectives, so to say. And I was hoping as I was typing that I could come up with some level of profundity to say that would really grasp all of this. I didn't do that. So I'm gonna give it to you, Neely.
Well, I think we just need to call upon the great philosopher Jimi Hendrix, who said, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace.
Okay.
Okay. But I want to give both of you that chance to add like a final statement, just a couple of minutes each.
Around this idea of politics and religion and the larger, and again, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, but where we are right now and this perennial issue of politics and religion and where we are right now, some parting words that you could sum up in your closing remarks to us.
Yes.
Okay, you're up, Dr. Gerstle.
I don't know how much more I have to say. It's been a really, really interesting conversation, and I thank you for the opportunity. And I'm going to go away and continue to think about many of the things that have been said and brought up. And I see there were questions we won't have a chance to answer, but I'll go away with some of those questions as well. And I invite people to write me via email. I saw one question about how do we reconcile Lady Liberty welcoming European immigrants and with America's history of discriminating against immigrants and people of color. It's a great question, but don't have time to get into that now. Dr. Tucker's point about love and justice not being the same, I think is a really important one. Religion, as I understand this stance, it calls on us to love each other, but we can't love everybody, or if we do, we get into trouble. And I think we have to be able to distinguish justice from love, and that there are going to be, in any kind of democratic society, there are going to be differences among people. There are going to be people who don't love each other, who don't like each other. And they have to find a way to get along and adjudicate their differences in a peaceful, nonviolent, legal way. I would say that American democracy, one of its gifts to the world, for all its limitations, is that it offered a way of doing that under its best circumstances. And part of our responsibility is to find a way to enable it to function better. To remember Frederick Douglass's declaration that the Constitution can be made whole, that a new republic can be created, that democracy can be made to work. And part of what can guide us is that the pursuit of justice is separate from the pursuit of love. And sometimes they will be distinct and in contradiction to each other, and we need to understand that. And I think I also want to say in conclusion that there have been other crises in American history from which the country has recovered.
Mhm.
And the Civil War was a crisis which laid the foundation for a new republic. For all the limitations, something new and positive came out of that. It laid down a new foundation which can be built upon. I bring you back to the Democratic Party's crisis of 1924. And then appeared a man by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt who managed to bring warring sides back to the middle in some meaningful way. This was Obama's dream, by the way. It was a dream that didn't succeed. But there will be others who call us to that dream. And I think it's important to remember past moments of crises that when America survived, did something that was positive and new, contributed new elements to a democracy where it was needed, and lived to fight another day. And I think if we have that historical perspective, it will help us hope that something good can yet come out of this critical 2020 election.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Harris?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, my colleague, Gary. Thank you so much for all that you've said this evening in this conversation. It's helped me gather up so much of what history, in terms of my own people's history and the history of this country, and to try to connect and intersect what that history means in terms of hope. When you talk about, I think, love, I think about it always in Dr. King's way of interpreting love. In his book of sermons called Strength to Love, he always emphasized love as the power to embrace the best of what we can see in the world that represents God and our humanity. And he never saw that you could separate love from justice. In fact, he had a sense of love being wed to justice in a way that it expresses itself in legal, political ways. And if it did not express itself in legal, political, legislative ways, then love had not been wedded to justice, because it's not representative of what love says justice ought to look like, and justice saying what love ought to look like. So I don't separate. I don't have this kind of secular, sacred dichotomy working in my mind when I talk about loving you and loving others. It comes to be a holistic vision of what it looks like when it's activated through all the systems and structures that express our humanity together.
Mm.
So when it comes to America, America has not loved Black bodies because it has not done justice by Black bodies. America has not done justice to all of its citizens, the Appalachian poor, people who are poor who are white, or who, for some reasons in terms of the conditioning of elite privilege and market capitalism and what Lawson calls plantation capitalism. And those people have not been able to manipulate the market to the extent to have privilege and degrees from Vanderbilt, teach at Vanderbilt, teach at Cambridge, and have those privileges, they are seen as less than as well. So love brings this solidarity around that which represents the humanity as God sees it. And if you go throughout the gospel and you see how Jesus in his ethic of love always wed together those who are the least in society as being the priority of God's love in the world.
Powerful.
If we can ever get new narrators of love, And if you talk about the Civil War, as you did so eloquently, and talked about Martin Luther King Jr., and now just recently, two of our most prominent alumni, civil rights icon, John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, when they talk about love, they talk about the willingness to sacrifice on the behalf of what is the best of what we can become together, and a willingness to die for it. That's love. When you talk about a Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court, who legally fought battles through the NAACP to bring justice to bear on systems that denied Black people access to American freedom, that was an act of love through his humanity and agency, acting on behalf of what justice should mean, because what love means for the whole republic. So my hope is that that love never dies. That love is resilient. That love has, as we say in Christian faith, resurrection power toward immortality. It will have an eternity in our humanity. There are two eternities: the eternity of humanity, because we're gonna always have babies being born. Humanity has an eternity. But the other eternity is an eternity where love and God can never be exhausted and never be removed from what it means to be in the reality of who and what we are in the world. So that's where my hope is. I don't have, as Dr. King would say, the courage to be as much as he did, or John Lewis or others who have sacrificed their life. I don't have sometimes the sense of the urgency of now to act on behalf of love and justice in a way that is so urgent that I'm willing to sacrifice on its behalf. And that's where people of faith come in. And that's where politicians come in. That's where politics come in. Who is willing to make those kind of sacrifices for the salvation and sake of the whole? So I'll stop there because I feel my, not only theology coming up, my
Question to
but
end
love is the way.
who is willing to sacrifice so that together we can get there? Together we can be so much more than what we've ever been. And I want to thank both of you so much for joining this conversation. I want to thank all of those of you who are out there who've been faithful in sending the great questions. And I do just want to recommend that you go and look at the statement of conscience. If you've not looked at it already, I want you to click on that link, which is on the Harper Hill Global Facebook page, and I want you to read it. And if you feel led, I want you to sign, and then join us next week as we begin looking at how voting basically brings out our care for humanity and for the planet. And so I hope that you'll join us next week. We have got amazing speakers throughout this series, and I appreciate Dr. Harris and Dr. Gerstle for being two of those amazing speakers. Thank you so much.
I've been blessed, and I'm taking away questions that I will continue to reflect on. Thank you, Dr. Harris. My first time meeting you, Dr. Gerstle. I hope that if you're ever in Nashville that I can get you a sandwich. You have given me much to think about. Appreciate everyone joining us, and we're going to get better as we move along. Appreciate you, Neely, for allowing me and American Baptist College to be a part of what I think is such a much needed place to, if nothing else, give people stuff to think about as we move through this period of such uncertainty. So I'm just blessed to be here. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gerstle.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, and to our host. It's been a really moving evening. Thank you very much.
Peace.
Good night, everyone. Yes, peace.